Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event. There are still some folks arriving, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jill Lane, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. We're known as CLACS. So on behalf of CLACS and its faculty and its staff, I welcome you to tonight's session entitled Digital Resources and Archives, Researching Latin America and the Caribbean in Times of COVID-19. Throughout its history, CLACS has maintained a steadfast, strong commitment to research in and about Latin America and the Caribbean as an integral part of our work. It's a key part of our master's level training, and we also provide substantial support for faculty and doctoral student field research. We annually run 2 competitions for summer field research grants, one for students and one for faculty. The COVID-19 virus caused us to cancel both, to the great disappointment of the students and faculty affected. And I'm imagining that the overwhelming majority of you are facing similar circumstances of limited mobility, travel restrictions, institutional lockdowns, and a great deal of disappointment not to be able to do on-site research. In these past few weeks, while we've been in quarantine, we have been thinking quite deeply about the new realities and the possible new opportunities of conducting research in a landscape shaped by the new global pandemic. We have consulted with scholars, librarians, and archivists, 3 of whom are here tonight, and they are teaching us to newly appreciate the wealth of archival material and electronic resources that already exist and which are already indispensable to scholars around the world. We have asked these 3 guests, 3 colleagues tonight, to share their significant expertise on this subject with us. And by the end of the evening, I hope that you too will conclude, as we have, that robust research is indeed possible in these times. I will introduce the panelists in the order that they will speak. We'll have an opportunity afterward for question and answer. And we invite you to write your questions in the Q&A function on your screen. You're welcome to write the questions at any time, but we won't get to answering them until after the 3 presentations. So let me now introduce, I'm very happy to introduce our three panelists. First, we have Angela Carreño, Adjunct Associate Curator for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Angela is the NYU Division of Libraries Latin America Specialist, the former head of collection development. She has experience with negotiations and licensing of electronic resources. She has leveraged this experience on behalf of the collaborative collecting efforts of the Manhattan Research Libraries Initiative, MARLI, and the PACLI Consortium, the Northeast Research Libraries Consortium, and the Latin American Research Resources Project. She is a past president of the Seminar on the Acquisition of Latin America Library Material. Her 2 most recent projects involve the stewardship of open access books published by Claxo and overseeing the transfer of the Smithsonian's Indigenous Film Collection to the NYU Division of Libraries with the spirit of learning, collaboration, and sensitivity. Next is Juana Suarez, who is a media preservation specialist and a scholar in Latin American cinema. She holds a PhD in Latin American literature from Arizona State University and MA degrees from the University of Oregon and New York University. She is the author of Sin embargo, Colombia, Critical Essays on Colombian Cinema, and Sites of Contention, Cultural Production and the Discourse of Violence in Colombia. She's co-editor of Humor in Latin American Cinema from 2015. She is translator to Spanish of A Comparative History of Latin American Cinema by Paul A. Schroeder Rodriguez in 2020. She's currently working on a book tentatively titled Moving Images Archives, Cultural History, and the Digital Turn in Latin America. She is the coordinator of Arturita.net, about which you will hear a lot in a moment, a collaborative digital humanities project on Latin American AV archives. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Melissa Gasparotto, who is Associate Director of Research Services and Institutional Partnerships for the New York Public Library Research Libraries. Her research and recent publications explore changing models of open access publishing and ebook discovery in Latin America. and the global information ecology around digital content. She is active in a variety of professional organizations and consortia, including the Seminar on the Acquisition of Latin America Library Materials, LALAM, Latin American Northeast Libraries Consortium, and the Latin American Resources Project. She earned an MA in Latin American and Caribbean Studies from New York University, so she is an alum. We're delighted to welcome her back, and an MS in Library and Information Science from Long Island University. With that, I thank the three of you, and I hand things over to you, Angela.
Thank you. As a subject specialist in the Division of Libraries at New York University, I'm used to seeing lots of students at this time of the year as they prepare for summer research. And often this summer research entails travel plans and on-site visits to archives, libraries, and museums. And so it was pretty straightforward for me to imagine great difficulties and a need for help in thinking through options that are necessary during COVID-19 for access to primary sources that does not involve travel, that does not involve entering any building. And so what I did was try to gather strategic steps that researchers can keep in mind as they try to navigate the vast amount of material that's out there. And that was my goal when I put together a guide. Digitization has made it possible for libraries, archives, historical societies, museums, and individuals to easily share collections with the world. Researchers today have unprecedented access to images of primary source materials with descriptive metadata that in the pre-digital age were available only to those who could visit collections in person. And we're lucky that that's true today because it gives options in the current environment. So I'm going to share my screen of the guide I put together with the students in mind that I normally have to work with at this time of the year. And I will ask you to please bear in mind that this guide includes open access content and licensed content. And when I provide access to the licensed content via the guide, it's with the authentication that's specific to New York University. Nonetheless, you should keep in mind that your affiliated research institution may very well have the same resource available to you, and it's definitely worth checking. So this was the guide I put together, and it gives a very quick definition of scope that tries to convey that I'm solely focused on primary source material. And then the first section is exploring primary sources. This has 3 links. The first one is a site that is curated by librarian members of the Seminar on the Acquisition of Latin American Library Material. And the emphasis is on open access primary sources. Okay, this is what it looks like. And you press here to get the full screen. And what you see on the initial screen is an A to Z list with metadata, right? And then on the side, you have options of checking by country or checking by format or genre. And it's constantly curated. So it's a growing list, it's an ongoing list, and it's a community effort of Latin Americanist librarians to keep track of the open access sites that pull together primary source material. So it's definitely worth your effort to browse a bit, to see what kind of ideas you might gather from going through a site like this. Then the second one is a bibliography pulled together by Oxford University Press that is licensed. So your institution would have to license it, and it brings together lots of bibliographies by topic. So you would want to make sure that you use your topic to check whether or not Oxford Bibliographies has one that is helpful. And I'm going to use Zapatista Rebellion. So this would be an example of a bibliography, and on the left you'll see the contents contained in the bibliography, and right here you'll see that it has a section that focuses on primary sources, including electronic resources. So so this would be another one that is a good resource for exploratory purposes. Then the third one is a guide pulled together by the archivists and special collections folks in the Division of Libraries at New York University. And I've provided a link because it gives a nice set of resources on the right side of sites that gather together global search sites for primary source material. So you'll see the link to HathiTrust, the Internet Archive, the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Online Catalog, the New York Public Library Digital Collections, and the World Digital Library. All of these have important primary source material. And HathiTrust is especially important for the digital surrogates of book material that's available on an open access basis pre-1923, when it's out of copyright. And right now, with the HathiTrust member libraries, there's even a possibility of accessing the book material post-1923. So these would be links to keep in mind, and they're pulled together nicely on this research guide. Then what I've pulled together are vendor publisher gateways. So there are vendors and publishers that collaborate with archives and museums on the digitization of primary source material. And they put out wonderful collections. You know, if I go to Archives Unbound, you'll see a gateway to Latin American and Caribbean digitized archives that are available via this Gale Primary Sources Archives Unbound site. And that would be one example of a gateway that's been developed by a vendor, publisher, trying to pull together all the work they've done in collaboration with archives, museums, historical societies, etc. And there's one I added here, Brill Online Primary Sources, because I'm trying to be cognitive of the fact that I'm talking to scholars who are gearing up for research coming from a variety of institutions. And Brill has done some important digitization work on Latin American content. At New York University, we have gone ahead and licensed one of their collections, the Archive of the Casa de las Americas, Cuban Culture and Cultural Relations, 1959 forward, in 2 parts. And this particular collection is important for cultural history in Latin America in general, and is a strength at NYU. So we definitely have it. But Brill has also done Latin American anarchist and labor periodicals, and the history of religiosity in Latin America. So those would be 2 examples of archives that are on this publisher-based gateway to primary source material. And even though we haven't licensed it at NYU, maybe your home institution has it. The Digital National Security Archive is an example of an archive that tries to pull together government documents that have been declassified through a Freedom of Information Act effort, and is also an ongoing growing collection. I've listed several of the declassified document collections that are part of this Digital National Security Archive, trying to make it easier for you to scan whether or not one of the collections relates to a topic you're working on. And Newsbank has an example of news content, newspapers and foreign broadcasts, gives an immediacy to a time period and is definitely an important primary source material. The Foreign Broadcast Information Service translates and transcribes press and broadcasting content, and would be a good resource to keep in mind for coverage of pre-1996 through the 70s. Under General Latin America, all I can really say is I try to include highlights because there is so much that exists, you really should rely on some of those exploratory sites that I mentioned for getting a broad handle on what's out there. But I include highlights here, and the description under each title and an easy link. So hopefully that's helpful. And then finally, at the end of the guide, you'll see 2 examples of research guides that are curated by librarians. And I give the examples in the hope that you will realize it's worth the effort to see whether or not a librarian somewhere has pulled together a research guide on your topic or covering your country that makes an effort to pull together primary sources. This particular one on history of Latin America was curated at Berkeley and includes a tab on primary sources with subsections on Mexico, Caribbean, Central America, and South America with considerable detail. So this would be Mexico, and this would be Central America. Okay, so these are worth locating. They could be very helpful. I think I'll end there. My hope was that the guide would give you a start, and I, as a librarian at NYU, am totally available during this COVID-19 period for follow-up questions, and I have no doubt that the librarians at your home institution would be happy to assist.
Thank you so much, Angela. I have a question for you, Angela, just a quick follow-up, since a few people have asked the question of whether, or I guess the question would be, how many of the resources that you shared are resources that one would only have access to via your university or licenses, and how many would be accessible beyond NYU or beyond a university context?
So you will see, I'll go through it again, but when I put this lock that's open, it means that there is no licensing, that it is open access.
I see, okay.
Okay?
That helps.
Yeah, and I'll go through it again. The research guides that librarians prepare are open. I didn't put a lock with those, but I'll put the open lock there so people know. Like this one, that's going to be open.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, I'll add the open lock.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Angela.
Okay, you're welcome.
I'm sure there'll be more questions for you, but we'll save those for the Q&A.
Okay.
All right. So, Kwana, you're on.
Okay. Thank you so much. Let me go to the website and let me share my screen. So let me see if you guys are seeing my screen. You are? Okay, great. So I think my presentation is a little bit difficult and different. Thank you everybody for being with us this afternoon, and thank you class for organizing this. I am very honored to be with Angela Carreño and Melissa Gasparotto. I think my presentation is going to be a little bit different because I work with moving images, TV archives, film archives, and collections of films in general, and they behave very different from paper, photograph, maps, and other resources. And it's also, I think it's because of the same nature of those collections, it's very difficult to do a guide like the very beautiful guide that Angela has organized. So as Jill mentioned, I direct the Moving Image Archiving and Preservation program at NYU Tisch. And what we do in this program, we are not really we're not only a film preservation program, we are a program that trains students to give access to moving images collections. So we work with systems to give access, catalogs, open source, preserving the materials, taking care of the materials, and making available to them. So I want to give my email now, and I will repeat it at the end of the presentation. It's juana@nyu.edu. And I'm only going to be mentioning one resource, and that resource encompasses many resources, but it's also a work in progress. So please bear with us. The other thing is that a subtitle of my presentation could be Digital Resources and Archives Researching Latin America Moving Images, or the value of human resources, crowdsourcing, and building collaborative resources. Because the resource that I am going to be sharing is really something that needs a lot of contribution from the experiences of people. And I also want to share a little bit where my views are coming from. As Jill mentioned, I'm also a Latin American cinema scholar, so I face the challenges that a lot of people face when trying to get AV materials and AV related materials. I will be talking about the work that we have done with MIAP Apex, and the resource that I am going to be sharing is called arturita.net, or at least that's where it is hosted. I am not going to concentrate in resources that are available in the United States, because thank God and thanks to the work of people like Angela, I think that these collections are more searchable. And so you have things such as the Library of Congress, the Internet Archive, and we also have a lot of Latin American universities. We also have a lot of universities in the US that have very strong Latin American studies programs and Latin American librarians. So we have collections such as the Eduardo Lozano in Pittsburgh. We have collections, very good collections at Duke University, Tulane, University of Florida, the University of California system, of course, the Benson Library at the University of Texas. So I think that's a little bit more searchable. There are a lot of challenges to access collections that are in Latin America. And as Angela was saying, people are prevented from traveling. And that's a little bit what can be frustrating to a lot of people. How do I access the resources now that I cannot travel? So I would like to also advocate for a lot of colleagues in Latin America that do work, very hard work on a continuous continuous basis to make materials available. And I would also like to illustrate why in some cases it is very difficult to access the material, and we need to be working on a collaborative basis of communicating and finding channels to share with people the resources that we can find. So apologies for the shameless promotion, but my most recent encounter as a researcher of archives in Latin America was the translation of Paul Schoeder Rodriguez, A Comparative History of Latin American Cinema. That's going to be released on May 15 in the context of LASA, of the Latin American Studies Association. And I realized through because the translation is not automatic, you have to go and find a lot of sources that were originally written in Portuguese or Spanish. And I realized the amazing amount of material that is disappearing from physical collections, even here in the States, books, journals, magazines, and that they were never digitized. And you don't really know, you know that they are offsite, but you don't know where they are going. And that's one thing. And also that I had to watch a lot of films for this book, because I watch every single film that Paul talks about, around 300 films. And I watched some of those films in very bad copies in YouTube. So that's one thing that for me was like a reality check on the status of AV collections in Latin America. The other thing is that through our program, NYU MIAP, we have done a lot of work in Latin America through our archival preservation exchange. So we have worked in Puerto Rico, Colombia, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, and I have done research in situ in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Cuba, and Colombia. So I think I don't know everything, but I have a very good picture of what's available and how archives can can be accessed. A lot of things have been digitized. A lot of things are in teras and in hard drives, and even in local servers or drives. It's very difficult to give access to a lot of materials in many cases because of copyrights. And then finally, the resource that I am going to be talking is arturita.net, which is a collaborative digital humanities project that I am doing with that my friends in Latin America and I are putting together a little bit with the shelter of Apex in my work as a researcher. I am not going to open this website right now. I'm just going to show you a couple of things. We have tried to accelerate Arturita because we see the need at this very particular moment of COVID. And we are in social media. Our handle for Insta, Face, and Twitter is @arturita.net. We also have a Gmail account, arturita.net, but you can also write to me because much of what I am going to say is really about facilitating things by building community about access to Latin American audiovisual archives. I will be talking about tensions and challenges that we have when trying to access Latin American audiovisual collections. And this is a little bit related to my book. In my book, the book that I am writing right now, I talk about the structure of Latin American archives, and I make a division between big archives, which are like filmotecas, cinematecas, cinetecas, fundaciones, the Colombian Film Archive, the Paraguayan one, and the Venezuelan work as a fundación. TV archives like the one of Televisa is Fundación. It's really a corporation in nature, but it's called Fundación Televisa. And so those, I will say that these big archives are most of the times funded by the state or the city. And even if the money is little, they get money every year through the Ministry of Culture or the Division of Cinematography of each country. But these archives are also pretty much invested, and this is not a criticism, but they are very much invested in nation building narratives or very static regional identities. So you have a lot of investment in Cubanía, Brasilianidad, Colombianidad, Mexicanidad. It's a little bit like high culture, no? Like what makes the high culture of the country, or very static identities such as lo Caribe, lo Andino, lo Amazónico. Minor archives, in my view, are archives that do not have an autonomous mission statement, and they reside in big institutions. So I'm talking, for example, about regional cinematheques, although I am aware that sometimes regional cinematheques have an overlapping with big archives, university archives, orphan films, private collectors, community archives that in Latin America are absolutely important. Centros de la memoria, because most countries that have gone through political turmoil and have Centros de la memoria have audiovisual collections. Family, filmmakers, filmmaker estate collections. For example, the recent death of Colombian filmmaker Luis Ospina. So who's gonna be working with that archive? LGBTQ archives, this is a number of archives that has been increasing in the last years, and they have been trying to recover images. And then a lot of archives that deal with new social actors, displaced identities, new identities, whether because of gender, politics, etc. So these minor archives, Arturita is making a big effort to bring these archives to the front lines, because these archives in most cases contain ethnographic material, Black and indigenous cultures, human rights, social movements, music, religious studies, anthropologies, women and gender studies. So they tend to be really very diverse in relationship to a very standard notion of Latin America and the Caribbean, or a very static notion of the nation. I will talk a little bit about tensions and challenges. We as AV archivists always hear people saying, why don't you just go ahead and digitize and put everything online? So I wish to remind everybody that YouTube, Vimeo, and similar VODs are not really archives. They share characteristics of archives, but they are not archives. And the information that you can get there can be very ephemeral, can be challenged by censorship, can be challenged by cost and access, and can also be challenged because archives are corrupted and disappear. They simply disappear. Also, in Latin America, we have issues like this. We, of course, have government and human negligence, such as the case of the fire at the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro in 2018, where a collection of linguistic records of indigenous languages that had never been digitized was lost. We have people that start to do efforts on their own because they see that the state, the government, the resources are not enough. An example of that would be the archive known as Permanencia Voluntaria that is in Tepoztlán, 1 hour away from Mexico, 1 hour and a half away from Mexico. And this is an archive that collects films by cabaretera and ficheras, films of the 40s and the 50s. But this is the archive of the Calderón family. That was a very famous producer's family in Mexico. And they also own most of the films of El Santo. So this really has to do with popular culture. And what happens with this archive is that Viviana Garcia Besne, who is the person that owns the archive and oversees the archive, had organized everything, although she is not an archivist, but she had been very intuitive. And after the earthquake crashed the place, everything came to the floor, so she had to start anew. So we have like a big need in Latin America to think about disaster recovery, which is really expensive. This COVID crisis that we are going as archives, libraries, museums, etc., is nothing else but disaster recovery. What we are trying to do today is disaster recovery, offering tools for collections that we cannot access in person. And of course, we have things such as the Caribbean that is constantly hit by hurricanes. These are images in Puerto Rico in an archive after Maria, which really proves that nature can be also aggressive, but there is also a lot of human disgrace. Because if there is no money for culture, if there is no money for the support of a country, of a territory that belongs to another country, if there is no money for culture in our countries, you can only imagine that archives perhaps occupy very forgotten line among the distribution of funding and resources. This I'm taking, for example, from Albertina Carri. This is a question that she poses in her documentary Cuatreros on the ICAIC news reels in Cuba, that she asks in the documentary, how come that this being the largest communist/socialist collection in Latin America that has the history of the left, not only of Cuba, but other Latin American countries, has not been declared World Audiovisual Patrimony, hence protected, hence digitized, hence given access. So I'm just posting all of these things because that will probably help me support the reason for the existence of Arturita. When we are talking about AV collections, we have to keep in mind that we are not only concerned about the films per se. We also have large collections of graphic material, film posters. We have, this picture is from Filmoteca UNAM, newspapers, theses, books, magazines, film journals, annotations, newspaper clips, photographs. This is from the Museo del Cine Pablo Ducros Hicken in Buenos Aires. And all of these are materials that we would like to see digitized and that we would like to have access, but it's very difficult to get. Collections in Latin America are doing what they can do with the resources that they have. But as I said again, a lot of things are already digitized. There is no online access. Then Latin America also lives in this intersection of very colonial archives as for the way that they are managed, a lot of bureaucracy, and a lot of paperwork to be able to access anything. And that intersects with a very neoliberal order and the so-called now orange economies. So we have in every single country initiatives that are born as physical books and physical magazines, but they are supposed to also be e-publications. Because every time we have a new president or we have a new mayor in a city, the cultural system enters in a derby mode to try to save a job. And the new mayor says, that's not an important project anymore. I am not going to continue with that. many projects that you probably saw 2 or 3 years ago online no longer exist. So one of the things that Arturita would like to do is to see who has the PDFs, and we can do the job of cleaning up with Cinematecas and try to post these things that have disappeared again. Another tension that we have, of course, is that not every single archive in Latin America is in good physical infrastructure. So we have a lot of archives that are facing very poor buildings at the same time that there is a boom in Latin America for activating the archives and very contemporary buildings after 2012 with the opening of the Cineteca Nacional in Mexico. We have witnessed the new building for the Cinemateca Uruguaya, and we have also witnessed a new building for the Cinemateca de Bogotá that opened last November. And then we also have the issue, another tension is that people want the films, but for us as archivists, everything that is in a rusty can or everything that is in a cardboard box is metadata. That is metadata that is very important to be able to construct robust catalogs and to be able to give access. All these nodes do not happen with a robot. We need the human element, hence my defense of the humans element, to be able to enter this into digital catalogs. These are very expensive processes. Not every single film archive in Latin America has a scanner. A scanner runs starting $65,000. In many cases, $65,000 is the operating budget for an institution in Latin America. I think I might be missing the Costa Rica Cinemateca, but I think that only these places in Latin America, as for film archives, own a scanner, and the two highlighted in red, their scanner is not working. This is a magnetic media rack. This is around $80,000. So this is really impossible to think that every Latin America will have it. We deserve it, but the funding doesn't really go there. When we go with MIA, we carry this very economic Apex kit for demonstration and basic instruction. This is $4,000 that in many cases for Latin American archives is very difficult to get, and it serves the job of very emergency work. But this also needs a computer, so it's around $6,000. When people think about digitizing images, photography, books, etc., hardly people think about the cost of digital storage, digital preservation, how expensive this is, how vulnerable this is, and the fact that we need to train people in Latin America so that they be independent and the archives can be sustainable. So that being said, we are very aware of all these problems with Arturita. And what Arturita is trying to do is just put resources that we already know that exist. For example, Archired in Puerto Rico is a very good website. This is in Arturita, so if you go to arturita.net, you are going to find it. Just not to open the page and get lost there, I decided to take some images. But we have put, for example, the link to places such as Archired is the Association of Puerto Rican Archivists. They recently started to work with AV collections, but they have amazing amount of lists and materials that have been granted access already in Puerto Rico. Because we are invested in university archives, then we had put some university archives such as the Archivo Audiovisual Profesora Dina Pintos at the Catholic University in Montevideo, and then the Archivo de la Universidad de la República en Montevideo. These are again archives that had materials on human rights, social movements, political demonstrations, history of the countries, history of the cities, home movies, etc. And I also wanted to remark on this because in many cases, these are very industrious archivists that are not expecting answers from the state, but they are really thinking, how do we build the infrastructure to be able to inspect and digitize film, even if they are still using telecines from the 90s. But if we need access, we have to use that. We have, in Arturita, we also have the link to places like Señal 3 La Victoria. This was a community television that was very important as a resistance site to the Pinochet dictatorship. And they have an amazing archive of almost 8,000 U-matics with images of demonstrations against Pinochet and community organization in the years of Pinochet. This is my students and some friends from the University of California, Los Angeles working there in 2016. Indeed, I was very surprised because in the last film by Patricio Guzmán, La Cordillera de los Sueños, the main person in the documentary is Pablo Salas, who worked with us in that collection. That's also a very interesting collection. Pablo does not really have a catalog. Pablo has amazing, unique material, but everything is in U-matic. And then we have partners such as Rafael de Luna at Universidad Federal Fluminense, who is doing amazing work in educating people and facilitating access to a small gauge cinema with something that they call LUPA, which is the Laboratorio Universitario de Preservação Audiovisual. And then things that already exist for digital preservation like GridPasa. We have also listed groups that have organized themselves in Facebook. So I have like a sample here of what is in Arturita, Arca Video Argentina, Gestión de Patrimonio Audiovisual, the LASA and the Society for Cinema Studies Latino Caucus, Preservadores de Imágenes y Sonidos de América Latina, Preservación Audiovisual Argentina. There is a wonderful place called Red de Archivos Latinoamericanos en Soporte Magnético. So I know a lot of people do not like social media, but social media, when it is used in a constructive way, can be very useful because many people that have this initiative cannot afford a website, but they have resources in their Twitters and they have resources in their Facebook pages. So I am going to finish almost now. I'm just gonna show you Arturita, and I'm not gonna show you every single panel. This is really an invitation to send us material. What we have done, for example, is compile a very complete directory of cinematecas, archives, filmotecas, big archives, minor archives in Latin America. And we have appended the social media because in these COVID times, social media has been very important for these places, A, to keep alive, B, to be able to share content, C, to do fundraisings, and and D, to answer questions on how to get materials. So social media is, for some institutions, you have a variety, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they have a YouTube channel, they have a Vimeo, and then there are some places that they only have one outlet for social media, but it's still one way to be kicking and alive, like the Cinemateca Universitaria Enrique Ponce Garay. And if you just go to Arturita and explore the site, you will find most of the resources that I just illustrate. Here you are the Facebook groups that I was mentioning. And basically the invitation is for us to think in a very creative and collaborative way. So you have my email, you have Arturita email, you have our website, and you have our media. If you have collections, if you have links, if you have important information that you think that can help other researchers, send it to us and we will post it. And that way we will be able to construct a digital humanities that is a little bit stronger and useful and that caters the needs of people. Thank you so much to Julieta Keljan, who is the moderator of Arturita right now, and she was big help for this. That's it.
Thank you, Juana. Thank you so much. I know we're going to have a lot of questions being generated by your presentation as we had before, and we will get to those at the Q&A. But now I hand it over to you, Melissa.
Okay, sounds good. My head is swimming with all of this new information. It's so exciting. Okay. Okay, how does that look?
Excellent.
Okay, great. I thought when I agreed to do this that it was going to be, a couple dozen graduate students at NYU, maybe Columbia, and then it turns out that there are in the list of participants so many familiar names, librarian colleagues across the United States, Latin American subject specialists, members of this organization that Angela mentioned before, SALAM, the Seminar on the Acquisition of Latin American Library Materials, who are themselves contributors to that amazing digital primary sources database that Angela showed at the beginning. So thank you, all of you, for coming. It's very exciting to see you all here. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how to manage this fairly overwhelming amount of information that's available digitally that we just heard about. I'll talk about tools and practices to collect, manage, and preserve your digital research objects. I'll talk about thinking about yourself as the builder of archives of the future, not so much as passive users or consumers of archives, but as active participants in archive building for future generations. And then finally, I want to leave you with some of the questions that I've been thinking about myself during this pandemic around the complex relationship between digital accessibility on a global scale and local community needs and privacy in the Latin American context. So if we were to put this moment in context, it seems to me that there is something of a continuation of existing trends, sort of accelerating these trends that we've seen over the past couple of decades. Those of you who may have attended the American Historical Association annual meeting in New York this year may have attended Ian Milligan's presentation, which drew a ton of attention on social media. You can probably go back and consult that conversation. Becoming a Desktop Profession, Digital Photography, and the Changing Landscape of Archival Research, where he notes that, quote, almost all elements of the historical workflow are mediated through a computer screen, and that we are all digital historians now. And of course, as far back as 2011, this trend was already pretty well established with this famous Ithaca S&R report here supporting the changing research practices of historians, where they noted that the use of digital cameras in special collections reading rooms marked among the most notable developments in the changing use of archival materials in decades. And there's of course the very helpful collected volume, Writing History in the Digital Age, which came out in 2013. So COVID didn't create these conditions. It's really accelerating them. When you think about how libraries and archives go about reopening when we get there, it's not going to be business as usual by any means. I think it's very reasonable to assume that library staff will assume a larger role in scanning and delivering digital copies of archival materials. And once libraries begin a new and popular service, it's very unlikely that they'll suddenly cease that service going forward. So my personal bet is on the library and archival profession scaling up digital delivery services across the board well into the post-COVID future, which means that we are not dealing with a temporary shift in research practices at all, but a more permanent one. And that means we need to change our research methods curricula accordingly to ensure that our future scholars have the training they need to navigate this digital sphere. So what are some of those skills, tools, and practices? I think one of the highest impact practices you can develop early in your research career is that of organizing your research materials in a way that facilitates their use and reuse over many years and projects. I know you've heard that a million times, but we need to keep the routine, right? Build these good research habits. In the digital research environment, this relates not just to the materials that you digitize, right? Take digital photos of through site visits when it's safe to do so, but also the materials you consult that are already digitized, like those that Angela and Juana talked about. And that often means establishing consistent file naming and saving conventions. It might seem like an obvious and simple thing to do, but I think we all know how quickly we amass many hundreds of images whose provenance may no longer be clear to us. Going back to Ian Milligan's research, he found that almost 40% of historians he surveyed took more than 2,000 photos during their last substantive research project. When you're conducting research remotely and via databases and the other resources that we've seen, you won't necessarily be downloading that many images because you know you can go back to the source. However, you will still certainly be wrangling an awful lot of downloads from potentially many dozens of sources. And, you know, of course, every researcher develops their own workflow for managing the overwhelming amount of content they collect in the course of their research. You know, evidence shows that the practices developed as graduate students are carried forward into your future roles. They really do persist. So it's particularly important to make sure that the habits you develop around research data management today as graduate students and early career professionals are based on best practices. It'll save you time and frustration and data loss later. I think a lot of folks in the humanities and to a lesser degree people in the social sciences really think that research data management is something for scientists or for social scientists who are wrangling big data sets in Excel spreadsheets, but it is in fact very relevant across the disciplines. So today I just want to recommend adopting 2 easy practices. And these are subject agnostic. You can share them with all of your non-Latin Americanist friends as well. And I'll put up a slide of additional resources at the end. The first, as I mentioned, adopt a standard file naming convention. There is no one way to do this. There is a really great guide at Stanford Libraries about best practices for file namings. I have a link to that at the end. And alongside that, practice bulk file renaming regularly. And by regularly, I mean multiple times during a single research session. For example, rename all the files you downloaded from one database before you move to the next database, right? So imagine how easy it would be to spend 2 blissful hours researching in these databases that we've just heard about. And during that period of time, let's say you visit 5 databases, and in 4 of those, you download 10 images apiece. By the end of your 2 hours, you may not remember where those images came from. And even if you do, you certainly are not going to remember a year out when you're writing the bibliography and preparing all the citations. So I hope that was enough to convince you that you maybe want to do this pretty regularly. And then just another note, some file storage services have a built-in option to do this, to rename all of your files in one go. I think Dropbox has that feature, but others don't. So if you're using one of those services, for example, Google Drive does not have a bulk rename feature, you'll need to rename your files before you upload them to your storage account. Windows has a built-in method for doing this. You can download bulk file renaming tools. I'm just going to quickly show you how to do it on a Mac. It's super simple because it's what I'm working on from home. So the example I'm going to use is the New York Public Library digital collections. So let's say we are browsing issues of this Cuban Gazette, the Gaceta de Puerto Príncipe, and you can see that there are 13 issues completely digitized online in our collections. And when we look at them individually, the library's reader doesn't really let you zoom in close enough to read it comfortably on the screen. So we're going to need to download it. Right? So our digital collections allow us to provide access to the high-res files to download. A lot of digital archives will do this for public domain content only. So I go ahead, I download 9 issues. You can see them here in my file finder, and you can see what a mess it is. I mean, we're lucky that in this case, it's NYPL Digital Collections. At least it identifies the original font of information that they came from, but it's kind of a mess thereafter, right? So in a Mac, this is just, and like I said, this is an easy, super high impact practice you can implement tomorrow. All you have to do is in your Finder, select all the items you want to rename, click that little gearbox there, click rename 9 items, and then you can select here the convention, the naming convention you're going to apply to it. So do you want it to have date or do you not want it to have date? In this case, I wanted a custom format for the name followed by the number of image that it was in the list. I click rename and voila, all of those really scary unknown files are renamed in some kind of rational order. So, so I just wanted to, you know, many of you maybe already have this practice, but for those of you who don't, it is absolutely a total game changer. Okay. Additionally, I just want to talk very briefly, I'm not going to demo, a couple of things that help you wrangle this additional material. There is some great photo management software out there designed for digital archival research. One of them is called Tropy. I might be mispronouncing that, but it allows you to upload your images and not only change naming conventions, add folders and organize it in that way, but you can add associated metadata to each of those images and collections. And it's like, you know, citation management software, and it makes your collections usable well into the future. And then OCR. So obviously it would be amazing if all of the photos we took automatically had a text file associated with them, transcribing all of the text in these digital documents. There is some work to be done, and it's not perfect. It doesn't create perfect outcomes, but you can convert your JPEGs to PDF, which does allow you to run them through OCR software, which, you know, it's hit or miss in quality, depends on the language of the document, the typeface that's used. Certainly if it's handwritten, it's going to be a real challenge to get quality text file generated from that image, but it's certainly worth trying, right? And then I also just want to mention, I didn't put a link here, but I want to point out that the Library of Congress has a very active personal digital archiving page that includes best practices for how to manage your files forever, you know, to keep them safe. So they suggest best practices like keeping multiple copies. They talk about checking in on your digital files once a year to make sure that they're still readable, that sort of practice. So I do recommend that you visit the Library of Congress's personal digital archiving website. I failed to put that link in the resources at the end, so I wanted to call that out now. But adopting those best practices is also just a smart idea. Okay, so let's talk web archiving. I just want to mention a couple of the phenomenal web archives related to Latin America that currently exist and acknowledge their uniqueness within the digital archival research sphere before going on to talk about how you can use a few different tools to create your own web archives for your own personal research use. So here I've pulled out several hosted by the Center for Human Rights Documentation at Columbia and a couple of web archives developed by a library consortium on the East Coast called Ivy Plus. And these projects really do reflect the great subject expertise in our libraries, and they are selective, not exhaustive. They're collecting and preserving some of the most ephemeral cultural production that we have in this century, as we know that the average lifespan of a web page is estimated between a couple of months to a couple of years, but your book project will certainly last much longer than that, right? So what if the web content that you're working with isn't included in these lovely collections, or it hasn't been added to one of these collections recently enough? So let's say that the page you need to cite has updated information that hasn't been captured by one of these web archives, and you need future access to a copy of that page as it looks right now. You're going to need to save them yourself. So another example of high impact digital research practices to routinely use web archiving tools as you browse the internet. This helps us avoid what is known as, or skirt, it doesn't prevent link rot, but it helps us skirt the problem of link rot. So what is link rot? What is content drift? They are the scourge of online researchers. I know you've all encountered a missing web page that was crucial to your work, and perhaps it wasn't available in the Internet Archive, and so the content you needed to refer to was lost forever. Before I started using web archiving services in my own research, I learned my lesson when I got copy edits back saying that a link I'd cited in my article was broken, and when I couldn't find that content, I had to change a whole portion of the paper. It was not pleasant, and I don't wish that on any of you, so don't let it happen to you. And if that anecdote and your own experiences weren't enough, I've provided a couple of terrifying examples that should certainly drive that home. This is a problem impacting scholarship across the board, from court opinions to journal articles to books to dissertations. I'll just leave that up to let the terror set in before I move on. Okay. But there are a couple of services helping you make a habit of preserving websites for your own use as you conduct research on the web. There are more than what are listed here. This is just an old slide from a talk that I give at NYPL every semester on preventing link rot. I'm just going to talk about one of these today. I'm going to talk about the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine Save Page Now feature. I wanted to draw your attention to this. It's located on the homepage of the Wayback Machine. There's also a Wayback Machine browser extension that gives you options to quickly see if a page has been saved at all in the Internet Archive or when the last snapshot was taken, as well as create unlimited saves of web pages that you might need to consult later. The resulting permalink that they provide can be used in your bibliographies in the event that the original is no longer functional. So here's just a little more detail about that. I guess the one caveat I would say is that it doesn't have a separate account feature, so you can't log in and see all of the pages that you've saved at once. So you do have to keep track of your own permalinks separately, however it is that you keep track of your citations and URLs. And it only captures one page deep, so it's not going to crawl through the page to collect all of the associated linked pages. It's only going to capture that one URL that you put in. Anyway, before I move on, I just wanted to underscore that ultimately the success of any research data management strategy is related to the consistency with which it's applied. I know you'll hear that many, many times. So if you adopt a system that works, stick with it. You will absolutely thank yourself later, and you will save librarians such as myself and Angela nightmares for years. So now that we've got a couple of research workflow best practices, let's talk a little bit about some of the other considerations particular to conducting research using digital archives. And as I said, these are some of the questions that I'm asking myself right now in the current environment. So as you've probably experienced, archival research frequently pulls back the curtain on the current historical professional practices of libraries and museums around cataloging and the often problematic taxonomy that's been used to arrange, describe, and provide access points to materials produced in Latin America. And in the digital environment, it might seem like these things can be less visible because researchers don't have to browse through a mediated collection arranged in boxes and folders, but they can dip in and out of these collections without context on a document by document basis. But I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things that I'm thinking about when thinking about digital collections. So first is that the universe of digital archives related to Latin America is not necessarily representative of the sum total of Latin American archives, but they are the result of strategic digitization efforts that may or may not correspond to your research needs, and they may or may not correspond to the needs of a given community to have access to their own cultural heritage in a digital format. So I wanted to put that on the table as a question I find almost as interesting as document provenance, which is how did this object or collection come to be viewed as important enough to digitize? Was it preservation related? Was it related to usage and demand driven by researchers? Are these researchers external to the region, and do their interests in this material align with regional interests in the material? What's the cultural significance of the collections? And what are the cultural sensitivities around the information contained in these collections? That last question in particular is of particular importance when thinking about community-specific restrictions on the circulation of digital representations of, let's say, sacred objects, the kinds of things that might be held in museums and put online without community approval. So there is this complex relationship between digital accessibility on a global scale as this ideal and community interests and possible appropriation and exploitation in the Latin American context that I just wanted to acknowledge as something that I'm sort of struggling with. There are, however, some great digital platforms that have pushed back against this. One of them is Mukadu. It's a content management system created specifically with indigenous community needs in mind, and it allows them to establish boundaries around their cultural heritage in the digital environment and decide what type of access is appropriate for what type of user, what level of context is required in order to make something available digitally to the world. There's also the Traditional Knowledge TK Labels project, co-directed by NYU's own Jane Anderson, which helps label digital content from a community needs perspective rather than an institutional perspective. Additionally, there's the Center for Research Libraries, which is a sort of a federation of libraries that also sponsors smaller area studies focused groups that work with within each region to foster community partnerships and help promote digitization initiatives that are led by community needs as much as research or demand from, let's say, the global north. So just some interesting projects I wanted to highlight. Another thing just to put on the table, the question of digital field research raises a number of questions today. Balancing researcher needs for data collection with the privacy needs of individuals and communities producing that data. This relates more to digital fieldwork, interviewing at a distance, for example, and related activities. I'm giving a lot of thought to the fact that some of the ubiquitous tools that we use to create new digital archives may have privacy policies that are incompatible with the research we're conducting or the professional ethics within which we work. So if you're interviewing activist communities over Google Hangouts, are you aware of the policies related to the data storage for that product? Do those policies open up the possibility that sensitive information that could put those communities at risk might be compromised or subject to government subpoena? Does it matter that nearly all of these teleconferencing softwares are using vocal and facial recognition to help enhance the products? If you're recording a session, what are the security protocols you have in place to make sure that the data provided isn't putting your contacts at risk? What's your data storage plan? Do you want to preserve these audiovisual interviews into the future, right? Our libraries and archives are full of journalist interviews and recordings, transcriptions of interviews that can be opened up eventually once a certain amount of time has passed and the rights are cleared. So are you thinking now about creating this archival content that may one day find its user, you know, a generation from now? And so if so, what are the preservation considerations you need to take into account at the moment? So I just wanted to put some of these considerations on your radar. I don't have all of these answers, and I'm not myself a digital archivist, but there's these sort of unique distinctions when contrasted with our in-person data collection practices. And then finally, I just want to mention this really interesting looking symposium that I came across. It's being live streamed on YouTube. It was live streamed today and tomorrow, and it'll be recorded and put on YouTube after the fact. But it's a Mexican Anthropology Association that is having a conference right now about the implications of COVID for anthropology research. And tomorrow's whole day is about field research and COVID. And so I just wanted to put that on your agenda as something that could be really interesting, and presumably we'll dive into some of these issues in greater depth. And I'm pretty excited to attend that and learn more. So I think, is that it? So that's a quick run through of some of the tools and considerations that I thought would be complementary to Angela and Juana's really fascinating presentations. And you can see here that in addition to the links to some of the resources, I wanted to mention that in addition to myself at the New York Public Library, we are also really lucky to have an exceptional colleague I'd like to put you in contact with. Her name is Paloma Celis Carvajal. She is our curator for Latin American, Iberian, and Latino collections. She's just a really exceptional resource who can help facilitate your entrance into the deep collections that we have at the New York Public Library to support the study of Latin America, and you're more than welcome to reach out with her as questions as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much. Well, we have, I saw someone in the chat said that the session was blowing their mind, and I'm having the same experience. We have some time to do some question and answers, and I'm going to look over the Q&A, and this is a great time if you have questions to go ahead and write them in. We'll be happy to have them. Let me quickly go over what's here. Let's see. Well, one person wanted to hear a little more, Juana, about some examples of the regional cinematecas that you work with. I don't know if that's something you might comment on while there's a writing in questions. You have to turn your audio on.
Yeah, I think that, for example, I'm from Colombia originally, but in Colombia we have the Cinemateca del Caribe in Barranquilla, and then the Cinemateca del Museo de la Tertulia in Cali is doing amazing work. Recently, Bucaramanga, which is a city on the side going to Venezuela, organized the Cinemateca Regional del Santander, and then there is also a new Cinemateca in Medellin. The president is filmmaker Victor Gaviria, and then you find the same thing in Guadalajara, and then you also find like very isolated collections and the impulse to create regional cinematheques. Paulo Antonio Paranagua, in his book Tradición y Modernidad en el Cine Latinoamericano, talks about culturas vegetativas del cine, no? Because in Latin America, a lot of the film distribution is pretty much linked to how migration and displacement move along the rivers. So you really look at cities like Córdoba in Argentina, Rosario, Recife in Brazil, they all have very small, even not very organized, many of them still with very primitive systems to catalog materials, but they have material that should be important and considered, mostly because it's significant to the communities, to the history of the communities and to what they have.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. We have a lot of folks thanking you for, you didn't get the benefit of applause, but the equivalent of the applause is the many people thanking you for your presentations in our chat.
Thank you.
And we have another question that wondered whether you had any recommendations for research related to Haiti in particular. So that would go to any of the three of you.
I have seen AV materials of Haiti very dispersed, and I haven't gotten, which I really appreciate the question, because a project like Arturita poses a big challenge at the relationship between language and cost, because I speak Spanish, I speak Portuguese as well, but like, you know, like Portuñol, like advanced Portuñol. We want to honor that Spanish is not the only language in Latin America, but we don't have funding and we don't have a big platform as to make a resource available in multiple languages and also include at least the most representative indigenous languages. So we have not gotten as far as to include the Francophone Latin America. We don't want to ignore it. We have a student in cinema studies that I am planning to approach. He's from Guadeloupe, to see if he wants to work with us in some of the resources. But I have seen AV archives from Haiti, and I have seen presentations at IASA, which is the International Association of Sound Archives. I have seen archives at Duke University. We have had students, interns at Crown Roosters that had like a lot of political movement TV here in New York, close to Chinatown. So this is the spirit of Arturita. The spirit of Arturita is that we, of course, are not going to put films online, but we are putting resources, and there is a contact and there is social media. So if people are looking for something specifically, I might not know, but the question will be out there for people to feed an answer. And if people are very specific on what they are looking for, they might be able to get results. So we want to think of the resource more as a liaison and as a bridge than a place where we are going to be putting content. That already exists. We need more connectors.
Yeah, excellent. Angela, do you have anything that you would add to that question about Haiti?
Well, I know that the Digital Library of the Caribbean has worked with Haiti and has a number of collections. It's a link that I added.
Yeah, excellent.
So that would be an important site.
Excellent.
Angela, do you include the LLMC on that list as well? Because if not, I would mention that.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
There's, for Haiti, there is a really interesting, I don't know if I can do screen share anymore. Let's see. Can I do two things at once? Just to quickly show you this. There's a really great project called LLMC Digital, and they have a very global focus. They're collecting a lot of legal documentation, but you know, in the case of Haiti, all of the variations on the constitutions over the years and having them all in one place, it's always, you know, very helpful to researchers that I've helped in the past. I found this to be a really helpful site to just have a lot of the factual information and the primary source record available in one spot for one-stop shop. So that's just llmc.com.
Excellent, thank you. Melissa, there was a question, just quickly so I don't lose it, because we're getting a lot of questions coming in now, which was a couple of folks interested in getting that information again about the Mexican Anthropology Conference.
Oh yeah.
Was there a link or something we can, or maybe I can, maybe Omar, maybe you could look that up.
Yeah, I plugged it into the chat again, but the chat keeps going so fast that I think it's always getting lost. So
if it's in the chat, then we can have people look in the chat. But
yeah, it's definitely there. It's and gosh, I can't remember where you know where I saw it. It's on actually the Salam Facebook page is I think where I saw it. One of the intrepid librarians who specialize in Latin American studies shared it in that Facebook group. So I can definitely share it with you guys and have you send it out to all the attendees.
Very exciting. Yeah, we would be great to be able to send that out.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a bunch of questions that have emerged. Let me just start going through them. One says, asks what you guys think of personal websites where one shares primary source material. So for example, I'm just quoting them now, I've gone to a physical archive and taken photographs of the material. Do you think it's a good idea and legal to put them on a public personal website? Of course, with proper acknowledgement on where they were taken and located, or not. What do you think of material? Maybe a kind of general question about online resources that are not in some of the more official archives that you guys have pointed us to, and how to approach them, either by building those who make them and those who use them.
Right. On the one hand, there's already a longstanding, robust, informal sharing network between scholars on the same topic who, share their files with one another pretty routinely. I went to this archive, or, helping out graduate students who can't afford to travel to an archive. There's already been a lot of that kind of sharing, but I think posting it to the web poses some additional considerations if it's not public domain, or if the particular repository from which they were secured had policies that really posting to the web would be flouting. So I think it's a case-by-case scenario, depending on the use restrictions at the particular repository from which the images were taken.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a satisfying answer, but I think it's the perfect one.
And I think it's always very difficult to give advice on copyright, intellectual property, because we are archivists and librarians and researchers. We are not lawyers, and the legal system is different from country to country. No, I am not very keen to put things on my website or on the websites that are under my management that I don't have permission. I mean, I imagine that a website is safe because if it is published, it's supposed to be reproduced, duplicated, distributed, etc. But I think that people have to try to do due diligence, and it's like a very usual shortcut to say I should be able to use this image, and it's always very surprising. There are filmmakers or there are people that own images that are very good at giving access. They might want to know what you are going to do with it. I think in some cases it's fair that people charge even archives to make images available, because you have to put a person of the staff to create, prepare the image for you or something of that. I do think I'm also a big advocate for archives to be very clear and have fees and regulations posted on their websites. That in Latin America is kind of a lost battle. No, we have a very ugly expression in Colombian Spanish, depende el marrano. So a lot of archives really work like that. No, it depends on who is the person that is requesting. That should not be the case. But my experience with a lot of filmmakers, when I wrote the book on Colombian cinema, a lot of people were very generous with their images. They just wanted to know how I was going to use them. And they wanted credit, which is absolutely legal attribution. So I think we as researchers should do due diligence, find out where the image is coming and try to secure permission to use them.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. We have kind of a long question, but I think might be useful point to reflect for the three of you perhaps, and it's from Matthias Butterman, who says, heritage institutions in Latin America usually lack infrastructure in a broader sense than digital, but digital tools, mostly open source based ones, have a certain pervasiveness that allows for the empowerment of communities. In Argentina, we've seen this process of grassroots digital transformation from GLAM workers up to people in charge of organizations achieve very good results in terms of sustainable digital access to primary sources. But without official policy addressing this issues, the effort is very limited. In the past, North-South collaboration like Harvard's DR class PLALA program served as a catalyst for this kind of work and the people doing it. do you think global cooperation could help make more Latin American heritage available online? And I picked this question in part as an opportunity for you to talk about the sort of collaborations over archives and digital research that you're either already involved in, as I know you are, Juana, but perhaps you each have something to say in response to that kind of collaborative work.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that I made a comment because I have always found that very disturbing in Latin America, and I tend to be not very popular in a lot of administrative institutions and cultural heritage places. I'm very popular among young progressive people, but not among bureaucrats, because of the comment that I made earlier, which the book that I am writing opens by saying the problem in Latin American archives is not necessarily funding, it's bureaucracy. Yeah, and it's that endogamic and that chronism that we have in institutions, and having a lot of people. We have a lot of people that know about archives. We have a lot of people that are hard workers, and this is why I am also defending their work. But we have a lot of people that are directing cultural heritage institutions, and particularly AV archives, and they have no idea what the film history of their countries is. They are not film historians, they are not archivists, they don't know anything about the digital world. They are very invested in social media just as a way to appear and be the center of attention. That has been a problem because those jobs are very political. So when I was referring to the intersection of a very colonial system of the archive, the letter city, la ciudad letrada, as Angela Rama will call it now, and at the same time, an intersection of neoliberal policies, and now the so-called economías naranjas. Now, it's very difficult to propose. People in Latin America do know about open access. Our archivists do know about open access, but it takes to educate the government on the benefit. And in many cases, the government is not interested because they are not going to be able to draw some corruption there, no, for their own pockets, precisely because it's open source. So yes, I don't know if this can be, it's like utopic to think this could be global thinking. These kind of contracts and aperture towards these things that will make things more available have a lot of enemies in the governments of the countries, because we also have to be very clear that we had very corrupted governments. And so this also has to do with the former question of copyright. Is one of the reasons because I encourage new creators to license most of the materials that they can with Creative Commons. Now, they solve a problem for themselves and for people that want to use their materials. Photographs, scripts, other materials.
So this is Angela, and in terms of US Latin American partnerships and endangered resources, there have definitely been important efforts, and I have noticed that a colleague from the Seminar on Acquisition of Latin American Library Material is in attendance, and I almost wish she were able to talk, but UCLA does a great deal of work on endangered resources through their digital ephemera project, and UT Austin has done amazing work on a out-of-the-box approach to archives that's more custodial and rethinks the kind of arrangements that we've been used to. Within SALAM, the Latin American Research Resources Project constantly looks for ways to collaborate on endangered primary source material, and have had some wonderful successes. So we're always trying, and yes, I agree, the bureaucracies are pretty amazing, and it's not easy work, but it's well worth the effort.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few questions that generally pertain to I guess I'm gonna bring them together. We had an initial question at the very beginning about work that's specific to the Caribbean. And I know that you've just mentioned the Digital Library of the Caribbean as one resource someone might go to. But there are a couple of other questions about the Dutch Caribbean, Curacao. I wonder if you have any thoughts along those lines, where you might send someone interested in those regions.
I actually had more hints on film festivals in those regions than in archives. But I'm not saying that they don't exist. My research has not gotten that far, and Arturita has not gotten that far. And that's really where the project could have a lot of value for people that know about resources, to just like reach out to Arturita, send it to us so that we can post it, and we can open more panels and just, you know, make this material, at least the information available.
So this is Angela. I'm going to share the screen. And at the end of the guide, when I gave 2 examples of research guides, one was a Caribbean research guide. And it just happens to be the one that we have at NYU. NYU is not the primary research library for Caribbean studies. We often think of the University of Florida in Gainesville as a standout for the Caribbean. And here you'll see Dutch Caribbean with a few links that tie in with the coverage in the Digital Library of the Caribbean and some of the sites that exist. And at NYU, it's just a quick and dirty effort to pull together links specific to the Caribbean. And I have no doubt that there are other research guides out there that do even more work. But there are a few links that relate to the Dutch Caribbean.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to mute my mic because it's 7 p.m. in New York City, which means the streets are loud. Have everyone celebrating. I don't know if you can hear behind, but
at 7 o'clock, yeah. It's
7 o'clock.
I hear it out my window.
Exactly. Just kind of great. Thank you for that. And I can see in the chat there's quite a bit of there's more information about others have been contributing information about researching the Caribbean. So I would point people in that direction. There are a number of other questions. A couple of them pertain to how, and it's folks who are working with some of these archives and trying to learn about sort of protocols for how to cite sources in some of these digital archives. And I wonder, it could be for any of you, but maybe Melissa, you have, is there a good source that you send people to who have questions about how to create citations out of the kind of digital material that they might encounter in these archives, whether it's ephemera or film or sound or what have you?
I mean, there are some really great standard guides, and actually I can pull together a list and send them out, although your librarians at all of your institutions have surely put together some really great resource guides, and maybe it doesn't occur to you to look at the research guides to find that, but this is the kind of bread and butter that librarians always put together, so there are great resources online. But then by the time a question comes to a librarian, it's really difficult. It's the very specific nitty-gritty. I got this photocopy of a news bulletin from, you know, Johannesburg that was created by a community organization in the 60s. How do I cite it? It's like, I don't know. So these all are, they're often very unique challenges, and there is no standard guide for some of these really difficult things. What we do is we look at the standards that are available and try to make one of them fit as closely as it can to the object that we're trying to cite. So that's to give confidence to the researcher to say, as long as you cite consistently, it's okay to use your judgment as long as you're following the overall citation style that you're using. Chicago is particularly forgiving if you're a historian, and APA is particularly specific, which also gives really great guidelines. MLA is kind of like somewhere in between. That's kind of a little difficult. But, as long as you follow consistent conventions, you're usually gonna be fine.
Okay. I wanted, Melissa, to ask you a follow-up question on your presentation, and really great if Angela or Juana have also anything to add. But you pointed us to some very critical questions around how to do interviewing research at this in an online environment. Obviously, especially relevant right now to be taking up those questions. And you went through very quickly a very dense and fabulous slide on that question. And I wondered if you had, I guess for the three of you, if you have thoughts on, I think this is something people care about and are thinking about. They can't travel this summer. They may want to do an interview or a set of interviews with people. They may be coming out of, an anthropology context, and field research will take a certain form, but even for people who are more broadly in the humanities who may want to be interviewing filmmakers or other kinds of cultural workers whose work they're studying. I wondered if maybe you could share a little bit the background, from whence you compiled that information, if someone wanted to go deeper in reflecting on what the challenges, protocols, issues are with conducting interviews online. And then if Juana and Angela, if you have any thoughts about what kind of advice you would give to a student who comes and wants to do that kind of work, how would you advise them?
When I started thinking about this, I went to look at guidelines for protecting your research subjects that every professional organization has. There are standard guidelines. They don't usually go to the depth of what do you consider when you're conducting an interview online, but they have principles and they have requirements, boxes that you have to check to make sure that you can say that you follow the ethical protocols for interviewing and protecting your subjects. And then of course there's the IRB at your particular institution, which makes you disclose whether or not you're putting someone at risk. I would propose that we are putting our interviewees at greater risk than we might assume just by virtue of the platforms that we're using to do this work because of the data policies and lack of data protection and lack of security when it comes to legal jurisdiction over the data that's stored on the servers, because there's a mediation, right? It's not just a one-to-one and I'm taking notes in my notebook. There's this middle stopping point and it goes across borders, and so the legal jurisdiction of course then is more complicated. So so this question of risk is I'm thinking more along the lines of how can we partner with journalists to get their take on this, because I think they're further along than a lot of humanists and social scientists in thinking through these issues. And so I am reaching out to the New York Public Library has long served journalists. That's one of our bread and butter communities that we serve, particularly independent journalists who don't have access to the large scale resources that a large news organization would have. And so I'm reaching out to my local communities of journalists to ask them, and I don't have anything to report yet, but what are the protocols that you use to assure safety of this data? What instruction do you give to the people you're going to interview about how they can secure their own end? And how do you determine whether an activist community is at risk, right? There is a judgment call. What does it mean to be an at-risk activist, for example, in a certain country? So there are still really tricky judgment calls to be made. I'm not comfortable with it, which is why I can't stop thinking about it.
Right, thank you.
I would say that I think it's very important, along with what Melissa just said, that for scholars, and this is very important for students and young scholars, it's also important for more senior people, But I think that in many cases, they don't know that universities treat even arts and humanities interviews as working with human subjects. So in many cases, it comes as a surprise that you're thinking, but I'm not getting blood from the person, I'm not getting DNA, is not an indigenous community person, is not a Black leader, why do I have to do a form? And it's not an easy, it's not a complicated, but it's not something that you do in 5 minutes, no, the clearance of working with human subjects. So when you had funding, when you are going to be thinking about funding, I think it's always good, as long as you are considering to interview people, to have conservations or something, even if you don't have grant money right now, get into the discipline of securing permissions from people that you will be able to use those interviews, that you will be able to quote the words, and that there will be something in signing that is either open, wide open, or has restrictions. Now, for example, if you are recording something, can you quote but not post in YouTube, not distribute the audio, not give it to a third person, and be generous with people, because particularly if you are working with vulnerable population, they will appreciate that you take the time to design your own form or find something on the internet that has a lot of categories for people to feel that they can trust you the information. You might never really have to use it, but you might. No, and that's also with permission of materials, permissions of pictures, photos, drawings, anything that is intellectual property of the person. I would say that that's a process that entails a lot of organizations and common sense. You might never have to use it, but just keep it. No.
Yeah. Thank you. Angela, do you have anything to add to that question?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the considerations are well covered.
Yeah, excellent. Let me see. Sorry, I'm reading. One thing I can just say from sitting here trying to keep up with the chat and the questions is we have, we certainly at CLACS were, like you, Melissa, started thinking we were organizing a little event for some students, and then thought maybe some faculty would be interested, and then thought, well, why don't we make it public? And I think at the height of this, for most of the presentation, we had over 260 people participating, and from many different folks who are themselves librarians, archivists, and involved very much in this field, to students who are just getting going on an initial thesis and looking for guidance. And it's so exciting to hear your work and to share your work, but it's also so exciting to see such an animated community of people around us, right? It's extraordinary. And I really do wish, I don't know which of you said that, I wish we had a way to suddenly hand over, to allow other people to speak at this stage, because right now we have all sorts of activity happening in the chat with people sharing everything that they know in answer to the questions that are being posed. So, which is a really wonderful, And I think it bears you guys are very much involved in the organizations that are producing resources for librarians, archivists, faculty, scholars, and students. But I think it bears our thinking together now, and at the end of this session, if there are further ways that we could be sharing what everyone is sharing right now, right? I know whether that's expanding the wonderful list that you created, Angela, and just keep expanding it with more and more resources, which could be one way to do it. But I don't know if you have thoughts on how we could capitalize on this to keep this community of people in touch with one another, and to continue to be resources for each other. Because as I said, our chat is just exploding with folks who have who are
Right.
connected to institutions and archives and projects. So it's so exciting to have you all here. Do you have any kind of reflection on that fact? Is there a way we can keep this going that occurs to you?
Well, one thing I wish we could do is save the chat communication to review and
the questions as well. 'Cause
take
we can get
advantage
all
of.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
Because as you point out, there's a lot of valuable information that's being shared via chat. That
Absolutely.
And I think that there are a lot of questions that I mean, there are like a lot of granular questions in the Q&A.
Yeah.
That, I mean, some of them are not really like easy questions or things that we might know from the top of our head. But I think that also the value of these kind of conversations is that we all know that people are looking for that. So one of the challenges is, I mean, for example, tagging Clark's Twitter when people are referring to these conversations so that people can go back to that. But we also need the connectivity and be able to look at the resources because of course all the questions cannot be answered in one day in one session. So it's good like to keep the idea of continuity and revisiting the conversations. Somebody's asking to save the chat, and I know that the chat can be saved.
It can be saved. Yeah, there's a way to do it. We just have to make sure we do it.
Also be saved? I have never really saved the Q&A.
That I don't know. I don't know. Maybe there's a
our guru, our
yeah, we'll see what I mean. If worse comes to worse, we just cut and paste the whole thing and we'll save it. But if all else fails, and the more we ask these questions, the more everyone will answer them in the chat. So.
Okay, somebody's telling me that it saves as text.
Jill, in answer to your last question, I would suggest that we just put out there a call for participation in a regular community of practice around digital research in Latin American studies, and just have an open forum once a month or something, and just, you know, see if it takes off. There's clearly an appetite for this kind of connection around this topic, and a lot of needs to be served, and a lot of experts in the room who can connect with those folks. And so it's a new global community that we're pulling together through this event, which is just so cool.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea. That's what I was thinking. Is there's no reason for this to be the last conversation. We should think about how we might continue this. I'd love to hear in the chat from any of you who are out there what you think about that idea, and how you think we might do that, because it would indeed be, I think, just incredibly valuable to keep us connected and to not lose this convergence, right? That's happened here. And I'm just looking at the chat here, seeing that people are saying they think it's a great idea. But we can, and I guess what we'll do is give some thought. I'm kind of thinking this off the cuff here, but we'll give some thought as to, we obviously can reach you through the Eventbrite for this event. But we will maybe poll some of you, and we'll be happy to have your thoughts as to, you know, we're all connected to so many different organizations and get so many emails. Like, do we want a separate email group for this, or is there already a platform where we should all join?
Yeah.
And, you know, to not reproduce things, but maybe we can give that some thought in due course, right?
We would love to participate in whatever is created. I mean, I'm speaking for Arturita, but I'm not the only person working on Arturita. We had a meeting a month ago, and Angela was there, Susan Lord, who was asking some questions in the chat because they are digitizing the films of Sara Gomez, and they are a collaborator of my program. But for us with Arturita, that's why the resource was created. So we have the email, we have social media. We will be happy to join other efforts, but for us, for helping people with AV collections, either locate materials or disseminate information, the resource is already there. So we need people to follow us in social media and to bookmark the website, because that, I mean, that's already included in the concept of the project. now the idea of the forum.
Right. Well, do any of you have any, I mean, in a way you've just given us a statement. I wonder if Melissa or Angela, do you have any final thoughts for us as we think about concluding, or what your hopes would be if we were to continue this conversation, where you hope it would go?
I'd just like to encourage all of the researchers out there to reach out to community organizations that you know have archival content, and find out whether or not they have plans to preserve that material. You don't have to sit idly by while things are degraded or lost to history or go into a storage cabinet who knows where. You can, put these community organizations in contact with funding sources, with at least your local librarian, who will know how to seek out opportunities to provide some preservation, some safety net for these resources. We rely on researchers who are going to these archives, who have these local connections, to tell us about things that need some help, that are super valuable material that maybe is in poor condition or something. And so in the digital sphere, it's the same thing. There is this website that this community group has put together, and it's not an Internet Archive, and no one's just think of yourself as this go-between that is facilitating the generation of the archive of the future, right? You are not just a passive user of the archive.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you. Angela?
The only thing I would add to that is, even though the librarians are carrying on with their professional work remotely, they love hearing from you. And the research questions really do generate thinking about the kind of decisions we make related to collections. So it's not only becoming excited about the work scholars on campus, students and faculty are working on, but it's also information that we gather that helps us curate collections. So stay in touch.
Exactly.
Sounds great. Any final words?
Well, thank you so much for hosting us. This was really good. And so you already know, Arturita.net is the handle, arturita.net website. Okay.
Oh,
thank you so much, Jill, Angela, and Melissa. You have been wonderful companions.
Likewise, I learned so much.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank the three of you so very much. If we were in an auditorium, now would be the moment where I would ask everyone to please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. There would no doubt be resounding applause. I'm certain of it. We'll conclude here. We'll keep the event open because I'm enjoying all the chat and all of the ideas people have. So we won't shut things down just yet, but we'll let everybody go on their way. And thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much for all that you are sharing. Let's look forward to more.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone.
I look forward to the recording, the text, and the saving of the chat.
Absolutely. We will save it all.
Okay.
Thank you.